Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Um, I'm gonna introduce our guests, the speakers for this panel. I'm gonna start with Mariola Alvarez, Associate Professor of Modern and Contemporary Latin American Art and Director of Graduate Studies at Tyler School of Art and Architecture at Temple University. She's the author of The Affinity of Neoconcretism, Interdisciplinary Collaborations in Brazilian Modernism, 1954 to 1964, published by the University of California Press in 2023. She co-edited with Ana Franco New Geographies of Abstract Art in Post-War Latin America with Routledge, which expands the current research by leading scholars in the field. In 2024, Alvarez was appointed co-editor-in-chief of Latin American and Latinx Visual Culture. She is currently working on her second book, for which she was the recipient of a Fulbright U.S. Scholar Award on the art of the Japanese diaspora in Brazil. That's great news. She received her PhD from the University of California, San Diego. Okay. And then we have Kolleen Ku, who is a PhD candidate in art history at New York University's Institute of Fine Arts and curatorial assistant at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. Her dissertation project explores the convergence of modernist abstraction, Asian racialization, and alien citizenship through the work of East Asian diasporic artists in the early 20th century United States. Originally from Hong Kong, Kolleen received her BA from Columbia University in art history and English. And then we have Howie Chen, who is a New York-based curator engaged in collaborative art production and research, and is currently the director and curator of 880 Washington Square East, or 80 WSE Gallery at NYU. He's a founding director of Chen's, a townhouse gallery in Brooklyn, and Dispatch. He has held curatorial roles at the Whitney Museum of American Art and MoMA PS1. His writings have been published by Primary Information and Badlands Unlimited and have appeared in magazines such as Art Forum, Frieze, and Art in America. He was the Jane Farver Memorial Curator in Residence at the International Studio and Curatorial Program and a board member of WAGE, Working Artists and the Greater Economy. Chen is the editor of the anthology Godzilla Asian American Arts Network, 1990 to 2001, published by Primary Information in 2021. A comprehensive collection of writings, art projects, publications, correspondence, organizational documents, and other archival ephemera from the trailblazing Asian American artists collective that sought to stimulate social change through art and advocacy. As part of curatorial consultancy Chen and Lampert, Chen co-publishes an advice column appearing monthly in Art in America. Let me get some air. Last paragraph. He has been on the faculty at the New York University Steinhardt School and a lecturer at the Art, Culture, and Technology program at MIT Parsons School for Design and Rhode Island School of Design. Chen holds a degree in economics. I'm sorry for that. Chen holds a degree in economics from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and attended the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program as a Helena Hubstein Curatorial Fellow. So our next, our second alumni from the program. So I want to thank you for your presence too and invite you to the stage. We're going to start with Mariola Alvarez, and then we'll follow up with the 3 presentations, and then we'll have a discussion and Q&A with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you especially to Tia and Yudi for the invitation to join this roundtable, and also thank you to all the organizing staff at the America Society and Asia Society, especially Kelly. And I also would like to dedicate this presentation to my parents who lived in diaspora outside their home country their entire adult lives. So I begin with black side. Hanaji Gua begins his essay, The Migrant's Time, with the consideration of what it means to belong to a diaspora. The idea causes him to pause because, as he writes, quote, belonging is predicated on something that is already constituted, end quote. How can a migrant belong to a community that has not yet come into existence, especially as one who forms part of that first generation of a diaspora? Guha maps the experience of the migrant spatially and temporally. Spatially, the experience is branded by the mark of distance from their homeland, while temporally the migrant cannot grasp the present since it is absolute discontinuity. Cut off from a shared past, barred from the here and now of the dominant culture, and unable to envision what the future will bring. He concludes the essay with this final paragraph. Our first migrant is therefore in a temporal dilemma. He must win recognition from his fellows in the host community by participating in the now of their everyday life. But such participation is made difficult by the fact that what is anticipatory and futural about it is liable to make him appear as an alien. And what is past will perhaps be mistaken for nostalgia. He must learn to live with this double bind until the next generation arrives on the scene with its own time, overdetermining and thereby reevaluating his temporality in a new round of conflicts and convergences. I begin here thinking with Guha to share with you the community of artists of the Japanese diaspora in Brazil across 2 generations, exploring the ways art served to knit together the present for them and offered the possibility of a future as artists in their new homeland, but not without conflicts, to return to Guha. Beyond just differences in age, the lived experience of the Second World War and Brazil's racist and repressive treatment of its Japanese residents set in motion a generational divide that in many ways was then accented by the stylistic divide between figuration and abstraction. I consider how the rejection of figuration and embrace of abstraction offered the possibility to participate in the now of Brazilian and more broadly international art, and not just be read in relation to their Japanese heritage. My set of protagonists features 4 men, 2 from each generation. I will first introduce the earlier generation. Tomo Anda, born in 1906 in Utsunomiya, Japan, emigrated from Japan to Brazil in 1917 with his family moved to Fazenda Santo Antonio near the city of Botucatu in the state of Sao Paulo to harvest coffee. Anda arrived in the state's capital city in 1921. Born in 1909 in Tokyo, Yoshia Takaoka left Japan with his family at age 16, worked for a short time on a coffee farm in Cafalandia, and then quickly immersed himself in the burgeoning art world of the city of Sao Paulo. Anda and Takaoka were part of a mass migration from Japan to the state of Sao Paulo, begun in 1908 when Brazil signed a treaty with Japan that brought 781 contracted immigrants to Sao Paulo that year. Between 1908 and 1941, 189,000 Japanese left their homeland and set sail to a country that they had never visited and did not share the language, but which they believe offered economic opportunities. Following the abolishment of slavery in Brazil in 1888, Brazil needed laborers to work the coffee plantations and first turned to European immigrant labor and then to Japanese. In the same period, the city of Sao Paulo was booming. In 1872, the city's population was 23,000, and by 1920, it was 580,000. Importantly, 2/3 of the city's residents were foreign-born or children of immigrants. The export of coffee and its increasingly international consumer base was the main factor in these changes. Anda and Takaoka became leaders of their community, serving as painting teachers and mentors to the next generation, and most importantly, founding the Grupo Sebi in 1935, a group defined by its Japanese membership and integral to the community identity of Japanese Brazilian artists. They were an art group that offered professionalization and community, artistic and cultural. Focused on recruitment, critical exchange, education, and advocacy, the group filled the void for its members, especially in response to the broad disinterest by the Brazilian public, as well as the internal lack of support by Japanese families for their children to become artists. The origin of Sebi was to form community, as Anda stated. Quote, "The group was born from the desire to work together and to critique each other and our art." The notes from their first meeting list their mission. 1, strengthen friendship between members. 2, monthly meeting for mutual appreciation and criticism of works. 3, always have a relationship with members when we have them from the interior of the state of Sao Paulo. 4, locate a place to meet or work, a studio. 5, maintain a good relationship with Brazilian artists or those in other groups. 6, seek to give guidance to young art students or beginners. 7, host a collective exhibition. The formation of Sebi occurred at a moment in Brazilian history when anti-Japanese sentiment and policies were beginning to crescendo and would hit their peak with the Second World War. Following racist models in the United States throughout the first part of the 20th century, and we can see with Chantel's that it's a hemispheric kind of model that is being set up of anti-Asian, anti-Japanese policies, the newly written Brazilian Constitution of 1934 limited emigration from Japan, reducing the number of those seeking entry in the 1930s and 1940s. This period was characterized by fascist white nationalism that impacted directly the Japanese diaspora. The policies included the prohibition of Japanese newspapers and magazines, the closure of schools with Japanese language instruction and the shift to Portuguese-only language, a ban on speaking non-Portuguese languages, and the barring of Japanese people to meet in social groups outside their family unit. As a result of these repressive enforcements, Sebi disbanded in 1942. The same year that President Getúlio Vargas, after much hesitation, joined the United States with the Allies against the Axis powers in the war and suspended diplomatic relations with Japan. The intention of the Sebi group was to nurture community and advance the professionalization of the artists, but instead its establishment coincided with a period in which the artists had to struggle to defend their rights to exist and live freely in Brazil. And I showed just 2 examples. The Anda is a little bit later, but examples of the kind of work that they made during that period. So Anda turned to representations of the time on the coffee farm because, again, they couldn't go outside to paint or come together. And then this is an example of a painting by Takaoka in 1944, which I'm happy to talk more about either of these in the Q&A. Sebi reunited after the war and began to hold meetings again in 1945 and host group exhibitions. But as Anda observed, the group changed directions at this stage due to the modernists and the other abstractionists. In an interview, he noted that the group's focus on critiques of each other's art, or the group as an extension of the studio, ended with the reformation of the group since the younger generation had a different conception of art, quote. These young modernists challenged the authority and tradition of the first generation of immigrant artists, leaving behind Anda and Takaoka's instruction of figurative art and by turn the pre-war iteration of Sebi and the Japanese diasporic community. This next generation that Anda referred to included Manabu Mabe, born in 1924 in Kumamoto, Japan. He emigrated with his family in 1934 to Colonia Eliseo in Birigu, and eventually they settled in the city of Linz. Flavio Shiro, who was born Shiro Tanaka, and his family moved from Sapporo to Tomeaçu in the state of Pará in northern Brazil in 1932, when he was 4 years old, and 7 years later they moved to the city of Sao Paulo. Both artists would find great critical and commercial success in the Brazilian art world as abstract artists. And I show you here just their early work, just to get an example of the kind of bridging between the generations. Perhaps most famously, Mabi was awarded the National Prize at the 1959 Sao Paulo Biennial. The late 1950s and 1960s in Brazil were characterized by an explosion of abstract art, both geometric and lyrical varieties. Perhaps more well-known, especially here in New York, given the Cisneros collection at MoMA, is the Brazilian School of Concrete and Neo-Concrete Art. But at the same time, artists were also practicing gestural abstraction. In fact, the Biennale before Mabi won his award, the national awards were split between the two styles, with the neo-concrete artist Franz Weissmann on the left taking the award for sculpture, and Franz Krashberg winning for his lyrical abstract painting on the right. Mabi and Flavio Schiro developed their own styles along these gestural approaches. For Mabi more than Flavio Schiro, it organically resulted from his early tendency to adapt a calligraphic stroke. While Flavio Schiro produced more all-over paintings with a heavy dependence on black paint, as if in a battle with the other colors he selected. His paintings often reference nature in their titles, with critics pointing to the impact of his experience growing up in the Amazon region. As Anda acknowledged, this shift to abstract art negated the objective of Sebi as an extension of a shared studio practice, whether painting from a live model or en plein air. I want to propose that in addition, abstract art stalled or slowed down a reading of the work of the second generation through identity as a sole interpretive framework. Given the political history described previously, artists struggled with being Japanese after the war and sought to assimilate into Brazilian culture. In the art world, one path forward was abstract art, which has long held the promise of liberation from identity and the freedom to create and invent. Moreover, these young modernists witnessed the limits of success for their own mentors. Anda and Takaoka did not find commercial success in their lifetimes, and I would go so far as to say they still have not found critical success today. Their works are not in the collection of the major modern or contemporary art museums in Sao Paulo, nor are they featured as central to the story of modern art in Sao Paulo. Over the years, Anda and Takaoka represented themselves many times, leaving behind an archive of self-portraits that not only show their aging process, but offer a window into their self-perceptions and how they embodied the role of artist. Upon Takaoka's death in 1978, one newspaper claimed he had painted over 300 self-portraits. Brazilian curator Paulo Herkenhoff argues that the frequency of self-representation amongst Japanese Brazilian artists was a way to counter their invisibility in Paulista modernism. Or as he writes, they had become, quote, a people without a name. He continues, quote, they searched to give themselves a proper name, to produce individualization, to fix the singular face and thus liberate themselves in the visual field and assume the right to an identity, end quote. The genre of portraiture provided the opportunity to make their mark on the scene, both through identifying themselves as individuals and artists. The viewer would know their appearance and their name, their face and their signature. Abstract art, in a sense, unfixed that singular face, and instead provided the opportunity to form part of a larger community of artists beyond any national borders. And yet you may wonder about Mabi and the way I described his work and the visibly obvious reference to calligraphy, and thus how his own heritage informed his abstract practice. For example, the work Untitled on the left features black paint like in calligraphy and ink paintings as markings on a rust red ground. The curving black forms most closely resemble the cursive script. Mabi also oriented the canvas to mimic the verticality of East Asian calligraphy on scrolls, and handled his brush to give the sense of flow and continuity required in calligraphy, since the brush should contain just the right amount of ink to complete the kanji. The whole work gives the impression of expert improvisation, especially as a result of the uncovered spaces, of the previous one of the canvas and the translucency of the paint. But as can be seen in this image, Mabi practiced his calligraphic stroke. Abstract art, and even more specifically, calligraphic abstraction, was not limited only to artists of Asian heritage. Rather, it was an international phenomenon. Calligraphic abstraction developed in Brazil, Japan, France, and the United States concurrently. And these artists and their works circulated globally through the emerging international biennial circuit, including Sao Paulo and Paris. And you see in this photo from the Sao Paulo biennial, the Inoue Uichi that I showed in the previous one. I'm assuming the red is to go back. On the lower left is in the background. You can see his work in the background of this photo. For Mabi, it offered the possibility to become part of the story of Brazilian modernism, as well as international modernism. With the globalization of the art world after the Second World War, abstract art became a kind of currency that could still represent its place of origin, but also be easily converted. By way of a conclusion, the first generation of Japanese artists living in diaspora in Brazil found belonging in the practice of art and with each other, in particular the Grupo Sebi in its early years. Much more research needs to be done to consider their larger connections with other artists in Brazil, though I should note many of them were also immigrants or children of immigrants, often from Western Europe, and thus how art created community beyond the Japanese colony, and thus Brazilian modernism as a story of immigrant aesthetics. As representatives of this generation, Anda and Takaoka found convergence with the young modernists of the next generation, but also experienced the close-knit circle stretched to include abstract art, international networks, and new leaders in the scene. Rather than the diaspora as a fixed entity or being, the study of Japanese Brazilian art articulates Stuart Hall's definition of diaspora as a series of, quote, ruptures and discontinuities. And so perhaps I can end by having us consider how diaspora can also constitute belonging through difference. Thank you. My thank you slide.
Let's see. Still working on the PowerPoint. Well, in the meantime, first of all, I want to thank the exhibition organizers, Chia and Yuji, so much for the invitation to participate in this roundtable, and to all the colleagues at the Asia Society and America Society for their assistance with the organization of this conference. This exhibition and the work of all the other scholars at this conference have been so crucial to shaping and now reshaping my own relationship to diaspora. So I hope you don't mind me beginning on a more personal note of how I came to this subject. Although I've been living in New York for about 12 years now on a successive string of temporary non-immigrant visas, I didn't conceive of myself as a diasporic subject until fairly recently. I was born and raised in Hong Kong, a city that in many ways has always been a transitory zone for refugees and emigres, and where many of its residents now have to grapple with new forms of exile and diaspora. And for many years, I didn't really think of my own move from Hong Kong to New York as a migratory one. And it wasn't until I started working in arts institutions that I began not necessarily to conceive of myself, but to understand my own positionality as a foreign worker and as a racialized subject within the art world at large. And so it's in this context that I began my research into the photographer Soichi Tsunami, whose name is not well known now, but whose work has been really instrumental to the study of modern American art. So to that end, my presentation is titled Surrogate Figures, Encountering Soichi Tsunami in the Modernist Archive. Pictured amidst the steel beams and towering cranes of Midtown Manhattan, in the throes of booming post-war construction and the shadows of St. Thomas Cathedral, a seemingly improbable sight emerges at the bottom of the frame. The landscaped garden and gabled roof of a typical 16th century Japanese house have been reconstructed in the Museum of Modern Art's Sculpture Garden on 54th Street. Pictured in numerous publications, including Life magazine, which deemed the show a Japanese hit, The exhibition opened to the public in 1954. It was celebrated as a thawing of relations between the U.S. and post-war Japan, brokered through the realm of cultural soft power. I'll also note here that this was just 2 years before the establishment of Asia Society by John D. Rockefeller in 1956, whose brother David Rockefeller was, of course, a trustee of MoMA at the time and would found the American Society a decade later. However, I open with this image to question, what would it mean to analyze this photograph as an autonomous aesthetic composition? To turn our analysis to the photographer's use of aerial perspective, for example, framing the Japanese structure amidst a riotous amalgamation of architectural languages. Moreover, what would it mean to turn our attention to the person behind the camera, the freelance contract worker, the often anonymous or uncredited documentarian Soichi Tsunami? Tsunami is a figure who's likely appeared before many of us art historians, although fleetingly or perhaps unknowingly, through his ubiquitous documentation of modernism's formation in the United States. As the archival photographer for New York's Museum of Modern Art from 1930 to 1968, Tsunami meticulously documented the museum's new acquisitions and exhibitions. He produced over 20,000 negatives for the museum, some 3,000 of which are now held by the museum's photographic archives. As Yechun Zhao writes, quote, "The images remain an undeniably important record of modern art in America, and it's no exaggeration to say that most students of modernism have seen a photograph by Tsunami." And while Tsunami's prolific documentary work has long buttressed the academic study of modern art and its institutions, there's still a lacuna in scholarship on Tsunami's own biography and his practice as a painter and photographer. There's only been one exhibition of Tsunami's fine art photography, organized by David Martin at the Cascadia Art Museum in 2018, and a recent article by Yechun Zhao in Aperture's 2023 issue on being and becoming Asian in America. So today I hope to recuperate Tsunami's absence from the art historical record and also to explore my own affective encounter with Tsunami in the institutional archive. In addition, I seek to question what forms of labor are recognized as art, what forms of labor are allowably anonymous, and how are these deliberations racialized and politicized? So I'll just begin with a very brief sketch of Tsunami's biography and career. Very little is known about his early life in Japan. He was born in Okayama, Japan in 1885 and emigrated to the US in 1905. He headed first to San Francisco and found itinerant employment as a railroad worker in Montana. And in 1907, he settled in Seattle's Japantown, where he pursued painting and became part of a group of young Issei modern artists. He also began to hone his skills of photography, and in 1918 started working as the assistant to Wayne Albee, one of the most recognized pictorialist photographers of the period. His studio was closely associated with Seattle's Cornish School of Modern Dance and served as a key introduction to major dance figures that Tsunami would later work with in New York. In the spring of 1922, Tsunami left Seattle for New York to pursue his career as a painter and enrolled at the Art Students League to study under the Ashcan School artist John Sloan. While his painting career slowly came to a standstill, his photographic services grew in demand in the flourishing world of 1920s New York dance theater. His lyrical portraits from the period captured the sensorial movement of dance in pictorial form, and he established close collaborations with dancers, including the young Martha Graham, pictured here performing her 1930 solo Lamentation. He also made his living working in the studio of Nicholas Murray as a retoucher and as a contract photographer for commercial galleries such as Pierre Matisse Gallery and Edith Halpert's Downtown Gallery. 10 days before the stock market crash of 1929, the Museum of Modern Art opened its doors in New York. Tsunami served as a documentary photographer from the inception of the museum and began his lifelong association with the institution, although he was never actually formally employed on staff. As MoMA's former curator of collections, Dorothy Miller, wrote, quote, "His photographs, to a large extent, are a visual history of the Museum of Modern Art." And indeed, his work forms an invaluable record of MoMA's now canonical or infamous early exhibitions, including James Johnson Sweeney's 1935 exhibition, African Negro Art, and Alfred Barr's 1936 Fantastic Art, Data, and Surrealism, pictured here. Beyond its role in forming the modernist art historical canon, during this period, MoMA also pioneered a mode of modernist, seemingly autonomous exhibition display, and Tsunami's documentary photographs have been seen to evoke a conspicuous suppression of its own bodily subjectivity and presence in favor of the neutral, depersonalized aesthetics of the modernist white cube. As Zhao notes, quote, his ability to minimize an authorial presence from these images set a standard for installation photography to such an extent that some scholars would later interpret the genre as reproducing an idealized white gaze towards art. End quote. The autonomous space of the exhibition gallery is only temporarily pierced by the invocation of an idealized viewer, naturally trim, photogenic, erudite, and in every single instance, white. It wasn't until art history's curatorial turn in the late 20th century that the spatial installation and context of exhibitions were deemed worthy of analysis in their own right, but even so, exhibition photography was used solely for its documentary and historical value, rather than analyzed for its own aesthetic or agentive potential. The installation shot remains diminished in art history as a powerful and distinct aesthetic category. As Catherine M. Floyd writes, despite the technical skill and artistry demonstrated in these images, quote, the intended function of most exhibition views conspire to mask their makers. In short, the exhibition view is almost always treated as a copy of something else, rather than its own original, end quote. This perception of exhibition photography as a depersonalized or de-skilled copy unwittingly falls into tropes of Asiatic racialized labor as mechanical, anonymous, or unfeeling. Scholars such as Lisa Lowe and Kolleen Ku have analyzed the role of Asian migrant labor in the U.S. as a sign of economic modernity or efficiency, leading to the twin tropes of the yellow peril and the model minority. And in both cases, the Asian American figure is cast as a faceless robotic laborer, in the words of Robert G. Lee, a simulacrum, a copy for which no original exists, and thus a false model of the American worker, end quote. Although Tsunami was not subject to internment as he lived in New York, his wife later recalled that Tsunami deliberately destroyed earlier works, including nude studies of white women, for fear of reprisal from the government. Barr's testimony secured Tsunami's safety and livelihood amidst a time of rising anti-Japanese sentiment, yet as Zhao notes, raises questions of what it means to use the quality of his work as a proof of political loyalties, end quote. We got our clearest sense of Tsunami's myriad duties at the museum from the testimony of MoMA's former librarian, Pearl L. Muller, who in a 1991 oral history declared, I want to mention the photographer Soichi Tsunami because he's never been mentioned in any real write-ups of the museum, end quote. And it doesn't escape notice that it was a librarian, another overlooked worker within the cogs of an institution who sought to recognize Tsunami's contributions. Other accounts of Tsunami's presence are more overtly effused with otherness and racialization. In Agnes St. Denis's otherwise glowing recount of Tsunami's photography, she notes his, quote, little Japanese figure silhouetted against the afternoon light. And as the Scottish pictorialist photographer John Drummond patronizingly wrote in a letter to Tsunami's former employer, quote, your Japanese boy has had some wonderful success. I sincerely trust that you and your Japanese boys are in good health, end quote. This brings me to my own archival search for Tsunami within the institutional archive. Tsunami was not the only documentary photographer at MoMA throughout its early history, and certainly was not the only artist to set aside their artistic ambitions for the stability of a day job. But I was drawn to Tsunami with a sense of longing, a recuperative impulse to capture a sense of who he was as a person amidst the 20,000 negatives he left behind. Sparked by a feeling of historical kinship or recognition, as a fellow temporary worker in the citadel of modernism, my own futile attempts are not just to combat his widespread anonymity, but also the mundane, racialized degradations that pervade the modernist archive. If the artistry of Tsunami's prolific exhibition photography is obscured by their documentary value, then the punctum occurs with the aforementioned Japanese house in the garden in 1954. Well-noted architectural photographer Ezra Stoller was invited to record the house's architectural details and vistas. It was Tsunami who was tasked with documenting the opening festivities. His typically silent, elegant, and composed stills now burst with activity as he captures officials in the defamiliarizing environment of a Japanese house in Midtown Manhattan. Among these photos, Tsunami also captured scenes of Japanese foremen, gardeners, and workers gathering in celebration. After nearly 50 years spent living away from his native Japan, what does Tsunami feel in that instant? Was there a flicker of recognition, of slipping back into his native tongue, of finding himself again? Despite the workers' presence in the photographic record of the event, hierarchies of labor still persist. Within the trove of publicity images, many of the Japanese workers remain unnamed. What type of labor is deemed worthy of recognition? In a suite of photographs documenting the garden's upkeep, we're rewarded with a sliver of identification. The young Robert Kobayashi is pictured sweeping the stones and replanting moss for the onset of spring. As it so happens, Robert Kobayashi was a fellow Japanese-American artist holding down a day job at the museum. After many years working at MoMA's warehouse, Kobayashi was hired as a gardener for the Japanese house during the course of the event. However, Kobayashi actually knew nothing about gardening. As he later told a reporter, quote, "I just kept quiet and everyone thought I couldn't speak English. If I came up with a horticultural problem, I ran across the street to the library and did some research." I think a lot of us can relate. What would it mean to approach the labyrinth of modernism's institutions through the side door, to traverse the archive through the life of an individual just trying to get by? As Gayatri Gopinath writes of her own archival excavations, quote, "This practice teaches us how to read dominant archives through the minor and for their gaps, slippages, and erasures." On the level of the finding aid, Tsunami is perennially relegated to an entry in another figure's papers. Although he himself was a poet, he wrote in Japanese, and his poems are now lost. I wonder who she envisioned happening upon this remembrance of her friend Soichi Tsunami, as she once more enacted the caretaking labor of documentation and memory, leaving a trace in the archive for a future generation of itinerant workers in the museum in search for a trace of themselves. Thank you very much.
While we're getting the slides up, I just want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Tia and Yuji, for the invitation to present, especially among all these esteemed colleagues, looking at Diaspora from an art historical point of view. Today, I'll be giving, I guess, glimpses and some curatorial remarks on an exhibition that I co-curated called Legacies, Asian American Art Movements in New York from 1969 to 2001. Oh, it's up. Okay, great. It's been great to be able to be in conversation with the appearance team. Particularly, I've been a big admirer of the thoughtfulness, the rigor, and also just to be in conversation with like-minded people who are working on very specific histories and figuring out ways of presenting it in new ways that don't reify certain categories or formalisms of specific fields or even politics. And also I would look forward to the roundtable. There's just so many things from just the last two presentations on modernism, and also the mise-en-scène of the installation shot, which I'll heavily rely on here, since we can't be in the show. I've been giving tours of this show pretty much constantly, and I know that my co-curators have been doing the same. And I think if you attended either of our tours, excuse me, you would get a really fractalized view of the show, and I think that's part of the ethics of how we're approaching the show is really, even at the level of textuality, even the the typography, the language, is to push multiplicity, or whatever words that we use now, whether it's multitude or multiplicity or fractalization or prismatic. I think all those things we want to resonate with. I would like to start with an introduction of legacies. Oops, I pressed two things going. So this is the main descriptor we came up with from legacies. This show had been in development for over 2.5 years. Legacies, Asian American Art Movements in New York City, is an expansive survey of rarely seen artwork and archival material by artists that constitute and exceed Asian American, a label denoting a cultural and national identity invented in 1968. I put this up here because it's, this is something where I feel like even at the level of textuality, we wanted that to resonate with what we're looking at. And these are the registers that we were thinking about: the textual register, the graphic identity, the historical, and the aesthetic encounter with the exhibition. So here you can see that this the lead description here bears the conceptual and critical software underlying the show, which is not only research-driven, which is really important for us to synthesize research across different fields and different disciplines, but also to signal that we're taking a critical sociological approach to what Asian American is as a category, as a taxonomy, particularly as a socially constructed category in every way. So even in this lead sentence, you see there's a deconstruction that's happening, and that's a nod to, as we know, Candace Chu has done so much work about thinking about Asian American critique as a project and a doing of deconstruction, and this is taking a page from that. Also, it gives a nod to the historical context of the inception of this cultural national identity, Asian American, to really nod to saying that this is something that had a beginning, that it had a historical context, and it bears a historical conscious to this show. And also to just emphasize the gap between the kind of, the types of deconstruction that's happening here is really to point to the productive failure of signification and description of Asian American, like just to see it performed textually, but also in the exhibition itself, and I'll show you that a bit later. Particularly to emphasize the gap between how and why people are signified, and the social representations, how they prefer or desire to be signified, and the social representations that are actually available in society. The result, I also want to definitely take note that this show is organized not only by me, but also by Janie Cole Southard, a PhD at CUNY, and professor there, and sociologist Christina Ong. And I'll go into more depth about their perspectives. Just to give you a little bit more detail on the language that we're harnessing for the show, I already described that we were using not only interdisciplinary and research-driven methodologies, but also we were looking through this history, Asian American art, through the lenses of art history, cultural studies, and sociology. And I feel like that's already become native to art historical discourse too, which I think the kind of firewall has kind of seeded a little bit. Legacies also uncovers how artists of Asian descent have historically negotiated identity in America as a set of situated practices and institutional structures amidst transnational diasporas, racial phantasms, and political imaginaries. And that's really chock full of things, but I think it's really to invoke a field of touch points that we hope to deliver as an aesthetic encounter. So there's a lot, we understand what text or a language can deliver in essays and journals. Recognizing the identity-based categories of art are bound to dominant and racial ideologies and political narratives of a particular nation, the exhibition instead focuses on a multiplicity of subjectivities, political horizons, and artistic expressions to interrogate life in America. Just to give you some background on the curators, Janie Cole Southard is an art historian who is based in the Department of Art at the City College of New York. And she has been working closely with Bob Lee, who's one of the founders of the Asian American Art Center, and also I think Chinatown, both in her research, but also as an archivist, curator, and participant in their programs. And her involvement in being in conversation with Bob Lee at the Asian American Art Center, and also her work on the Asian American Art Center archive has been really important to this exhibition. Since that space, that organization was a seminal nonprofit community organization that presented an unbelievable roster of artists, but also as an example of an autonomous institution making that was particular to, I guess, the Asian American movement and trying to figure out how to create institutions for us, by us. I think that would be kind of the model. If institutions weren't including artists, that you would have to imagine create spaces. The third collaborator is Christina Ong, who is a sociologist and a postdoc scholar at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. And her research particularly looks at political activism and artistic production in the 70s and 80s, and which led her to looking at the Basement Workshop, which is a super important Pan-Asian political and arts organization based in Chinatown in the 70s. And her close work as a sociologist, interviewing participants, and also looking through the material productions of their community projects and also their art production was super important to be able to represent the community component for the show, but also the politically activated organizing that was specific to Basement Workshop. I guess the third thing to talk about is that this show has these modules that are spread out through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, meaning that in the 70s, the Basement Workshop is one of the modules to represent the political collectivist component of the exhibition. And then in the 80s, the Asian American Art Center is another module in which we look at the history, but also the effort of producing an institution of Asian American culture. And then finally in the 90s, the module is built around the Godzilla, Asian American Art Network. And then what you'll see in the exhibition installation documentation is a stitching of artistic activities and art making throughout the time, so that these modules have a context and that the individual artworks also have a context of collectivity that was happening contemporaneously. I was really part of it just thinking about these two exhibitions side by side, that it was really fortuitous that they're actually happening together, and just thinking about the discursive dialectics of like how we can approach something like art and artists by people of Asian descent. There's these categories, racialized or demarcated by other kind of disciplines. So for us, when we were putting together the exhibition, was to think about not only the history of Asian American art as it's been studied, but also to think about it as an object that is also a technology, technology that is specific to the cultural national project of America. Just to think about that, and then having a show that's about diaspora, that's happening contemporaneously, really pulls, and puts this cultural national identity into a different hemispheric context, which I think is super important. Psychically, it would be very different for me. I'm just so excited that these two shows are happening. At the same time, I feel like now that we see these two side by side, we can start thinking about this taxonomic technology and the kind of histories that are behind it, right? When Kolleen had mentioned, the founding of these modernist Western institutions that are cultural and also political, that has roots, and something that would be great to talk about is that the roots in area studies that was forged in the U.S. and Europe, that these labels like Asia, or thinking about diaspora and even cultural national identity in those contexts will be really fruitful. Oops. Again, I think even on the level of typography and design, we really wanted to highlight the reason why we named the show Art Movements with an S. I think we really wanted to also examine and interrogate this idea that that out of the late '60s, that there was a movement of that was singular. I think it erases and it conflates a lot of the struggles that are happening that are, as I mentioned, fractalized or have different horizons. If you think about feminism or LGBTQ project, there's no way that there's one thing that could actually fall under that a singular movement. And that's adding the S actually relieves us of the idea of having to tell a singular story about Asian American art as a function of a civil rights movement that has an end goal. So partly also to address the kind of crisis, not kind of, it's an apparent crisis that as institutional exhibitions proliferate that have become more inclusive in America, under different DEI regimes and pressures by marginalized groups, there is a palpable feeling that the shows are increasingly dissatisfying for the people that are being represented in the shows. So I think by highlighting that there are multiple movements shows that, sure, there have been gains in certain struggles, but for many, the struggles have just begun or are still not visible. So that, why is there such dissatisfaction? One of the answers from our team was just say, there's just so many different struggles that are happening that have not achieved the level of emancipatory, real emancipation that people are searching for. This is a design of the graphic that leads our show, and we even on the level of this is done by Chenzo Studio, and the direction was to really think about even at the wireframe structure of the logo needs to also reflect the approach to the exhibition. And the result is we have over 90 artists in the exhibition and over 140 objects. And the challenge was to figure out a way to create adjacencies that not only highlighted different types of resonances, but not erase the specific individual projects of the artists. And then I guess I think, okay, so maybe I'll just say in terms of the presentation of the show, I would say that I think that one of the topic points is archival methods and approaches, and I would say that how we approach this exhibition in selecting artists, and that's a big question, is we did, I think, looking back, take also tools from archival kind of method in which we we did deep research in not only the the history of exhibition making for Asian American art, but also we scoured art historical writings, and those same writings that were presented today, but also to index artists that were left out or that we were aware of that were practicing at the same time. And on the level of selecting art, we mostly selected and borrowed works from artists directly, or their states. And the prompts were to dig deep into the archives, into their own memories, to be able to pick out works that have not seen the light of day, or have been underseen, or have been skipped over curatorially. So I would really invite people to come see the show. There's so much to talk about. So just to give you, a few visuals on the exhibition and the mise en scène that in terms of like is created and the adjacencies of the shows, of the works in the show. This is some of the stuff. Great. Thank you so much. Sorry, we're running out of time.
So thank you so much for being here. I am one of the co-curators of the appearance, and I was just overhearing someone asking why this exhibition is titled The Appearance. So if you stick with us, we are going to, after this presentation, we are going to America Society, just crossing the street, and we're going to have a curatorial presentation. Yudi and I will give a curatorial presentation, which is going to be like a very interesting segue to your curatorial presentation of legacies. And then we'll have keynote talk by Tao Li Goff, who is a super scholar. She's not here yet. Yeah, she's gonna be there, yeah. So thank you so much for all these wonderful presentations. We have different, case studies, different geographies thinking about diaspora. We are gonna ask, I'm gonna just get us started with a very basic questions so that the public knows a little bit the context of your researches. So my initial question is, how does each of these case studies and presentations fit within your larger research topics, interests, practices, etc.?
So I got my PhD at UC San Diego, where I wrote the dissertation that became the book that Yudi said the name, which is on the Rio de Janeiro-based poetry and artistic movement, neo-concretism. And so again, I was saying, showed the image of Leisha Clark, because I feel most people in New York are familiar with her work. So she was one of the neo-concretists. And so in my research on them and doing archival research, I kept especially coming across Mabi at that time when I was doing the dissertation research. And he was not as discussed, within, especially in the U.S. and U.S. scholarship. And so then it's that kind of thing that I feel like Kolleen might have also as like a peripheral vision of you become interested, but you have to finish this one project. And I had the kind of on the periphery and became really interested in him. And that when I continued looking, it was he was very successful in the 1950s, and so why this kind of absence within U.S. scholarship, especially on his work, and other, I would say specifically Japanese, Brazilian artists, and I would say more broadly on gestural abstraction. It's sort of this strange, I think, many times Latin America serves as a mirror to the U.S. Then because abstract expressionism was so popular in the U.S., then it felt like Latin America had to give more credence to concrete art or geometric abstraction. And then, so I became very interested in him and Flavio Shiro and Tomio Taki, who I didn't talk about today, who's included in the exhibition. And then from there, which I've been working on their history of abstraction, went to the two teachers again and mentors. And so that's what I'm going to have an article on their work coming out next year. And so looking at that very early generation and figuration. And again, the further disappearance to this appearance, even within, I would say, Brazilian and Portuguese language art history. So the absence of them and, really giving value to the kind of work that they made. And, so that also has just led to questions of, again, how do we give value within the canon to particular styles, but again, also particular figures. So again, here in New York, you're all familiar with Tarsila do Amaral, for example. So, why did she get attention, for example, in opposition to somebody else? So thinking about those kinds of questions.
I can go next. Is this working? Okay, great. Well, so the Tsunami Project is actually kind of peripheral to my current dissertation research. It's a nagging personal project. My dissertation centers on the relationship between abstraction and racialization, but in Japanese American artists working in the U.S. at mid-century. But kind of on a broader kind of theme of how I got to working on Asian diasporic art, I was really trained as a European modernist. I wrote 2 of my previous theses on the Soviet avant-garde, and it really wasn't until, I would say, 2020 when both kind of personally and within the field, I felt that there was space and the precedent of scholars that I could really take on this project on Asian diasporic art. We all know, this is a very young field, it's a very young discipline, and I think it's really exciting to be working on these issues at this current moment, but it was never a class for me when I started college. And as for the Soichi Tsunami project, I like to joke that it began as a workplace procrastination project when I started at the Museum of Modern Art as a fellow, but now it's become a bit of a workplace reclamation project.
So, I think I'm not an Asian Americanist, so I see this as part of a larger project and interest. Also, decolonization from the critical studies that I was involved in early on. I'm interested in the sociology of critique, mainly how social critique, which is collectivist, things that you associate with the late 60s in terms of like labor and third world internationalist social critique, and an artistic critique, which has another draw to it, which is autonomy. And these 2 things that drove critique, I'm interested in how over time how those critiques play out and how institutions absorb, respond, and neutralize the critique. So for me, like the sweep of this Asian American art show from the late 60s to 2001, which is kind of like the start of some kind of art globalism, is really the big story. The big arc is kind of the melancholic story of the breakdown in artistic and social critique, the ability to question reality and transform institutions or reality in general. Yeah.
I'm one of the moderators, so I'm gonna continue by saying that unfortunately we are a little bit late with our time. So we had prepared like a few questions, and there's so much to talk about. After these presentations, there's really, each presentation in itself brings so many questions. But we'll have to be kind of like faster, even though I'm being contradictory. So. Okay, so I wanted to ask a question that regards like the way regards some events in history that like defined certain periods of time that I feel like were very kind of important to all of your papers, all of your projects. So, for example, the divide between pre and post Second World War in both of your presentations. Maybe Mariola was more direct in pointing that out, but I feel like there are some other things to maybe comment more on. Maybe like the role of the change in the relationship with Asian culture, the post-war period, and the reception of these artists as something that created a divide in reception, but not necessarily that reflected the distance between themselves as like Seibikai was most strong and kind of gathered after the Second World War, right, with the saloons, all the events they organized. So they, even though they were, they had different approaches to arts, they were very close and they kept close as a group. So that's some provocation in that sense to see maybe like how those questions also fit in this. From like there's a curator from that has passed away already from LA that has an exhibition on her, an article that she jokes with the idea from enemy alien to Zen masters, right?
Karen Higa.
Yeah, Karen Higa. So I think that's like a lot something that is connected to the contest in Brazil as well. And Kolleen, there's like a clear in the trajectory of the photographer you're looking at. You see like the period that he worked at MoMA from 30s to the 60s, and that like the moment where you choose to look into like something that is happening in his photographs, like 54, it's also like part of this maybe division, like so. Maybe if you could comment more if those find anything or you think that this could be part of the equation. And for Howie, like that's the title in itself, right? Like it's something that I feel in the idea of like the long 60s, right? Like a different moment that also traverses the artistic production in Latin America, right? And the art of the Japanese diaspora as well in Latin America. So it kind of like it's a kind of a structure of periodization that works across like both like all of your works. So if you could comment a little bit more on that.
Can I just one addition to Howie's temporality specifically, like what's the difference between this long 60s, 70s, and then 80s and 90s, and the difference between these different movements?
Yeah, I could answer that real quick.
Yeah.
It'll be so long. So basically, like, I think I'm interested in the long tail of modernism, especially within marginalized groups, because, especially in the 70s, as I was looking at the work and thinking about it more, that, abstraction or conceptualism, these are kind of international art languages, right? These are aesthetics that you can actually, or you can either imagine or be in a kind of discursive group that's beyond, let's say, an ethnic enclave or a nation. But as you see it play out in America, especially, especially abstraction, just expressive or even conceptual, it's very brief. And then you look at the 80s and 90s, you see, like what Mariola said, like there was like this kind of turning inward of like, there's like figuration and self-portraiture. There's almost like a breakdown of this kind of horizon for beyond nationhood or art as a possibility for like universal claim to universality. But the 90s, with the culture wars in America, it's just all of that is it's out the window. It's just full atomization of particularities. So you see this pendulum swing from universality to the particular, and I think that's how I kind of like see these three periods. And I don't know what we're in right now, but it's a hallucination maybe of individuality. But I think that's where I think how the late 60s being like kind of like the halcyon kind of fantasy of internationalism or whatever it is.
Should we go down the line? Well, thanks for that question. I think Tsunamis as a figure is so interesting to me precisely because he straddles these time periods, right? He worked at MoMA from 1929 to 68. And so it's a period that doesn't get talked about much in Asian American history because it was before the founding of the term, before the founding of the discipline. It was during the exclusion era where people were barred from entering the US, but there were obviously people of Asian descent working and living and making art in New York City and in the West Coast as well. But also just I'd be curious what he thought about the kind of evolution of the art world at the time. You know, if you look through his installation shots, they go from fantastic art, dada, and surrealism to pop. And it's kind of, I chose to focus on the moment of the Japanese house and the garden in the 50s, precisely because there was this moment of institutions in New York looking outward. And as Howie mentioned before, this like interest in area studies, this interest in kind of re-engaging with the world in the post-war order. And I think a lot of us can relate to the experience of kind of learning about your own culture and learning about, you know, Asian art, for example, through the lens of it being translated to the West. So that was this kind of tension, this like double consciousness that I was interested in exploring.
Thank you. I feel like I don't know if I can come up with a coherent response because I have so many thoughts about it. And as Kolleen said, I was, you know, I think of myself as a specialist of post-war art. That's where my interest lies. And so again, working on the abstract artists initially, and really thinking about the post-war moment in Brazil as, again, this kind of coming out that there is, to me, exactly like Howie said, after the war, I think every place around the world thought like this is, we can all shine simultaneously, and that it won't be Paris as kind of the center. And so, you know, as Serge Gubeau talks about, New York then stole that and became the center, and the US centered itself. But, you know, I think there is this kind of moment that out of trauma came like a kind of optimism of the way that you could have this real internationally connected, and we call it global, but I mean an international connection. And so, you know, I'm really interested in the way that artists and artworks and ideas and, you know, through publications were traveling at that time that then exposed artists everywhere, you know, simultaneously. So, you know, through the biennial, of course, in Sao Paulo, you're having that calligraphic abstraction coming from Japan, for example, but then Mabi and Flavio Shido traveling to Paris. So, you know, really interested in that circulation. But I felt like the more that I looked at the post-war, then I needed to go pre-war, and that you couldn't disconnect those periods, and thinking, you know, very much about the early 20th century, that, you know, it is a hemispheric history, because the reason why Japan turns to Brazil is because they can't go to the US anymore because of exclusion. And so then, you know, you have this kind of domino effect, or again, with the ending of slavery in Brazil, that's the last country in the hemisphere to do that, then they have to turn to labor outside of the slave trade. And so then, you know, again, looking at that history of violence that is happening hemispherically, and then to Japan, you know, what their role in this is, that they wanted to become an empire. And so part of becoming an empire was that you had to have a large population. And so you have a population that exceeds the land. So then they need to send that population somewhere. So it's just this way that you can't, you know, only kind of look at one place. And so it's interesting, again, like how he's saying of this kind of moment again of beyond nations, that I do think abstraction, you know, provides again that sense of utopia. I think at the same time, the more cynical take is that like everyone is again trying to convert currency that could just sort of circulate seamlessly. And so I think it's, you have to look then at that pre-war moment where I think that history of violence is so present. And thinking again about just, yeah, I did not mean to make it seem that these generations were only in conflict. They were in convergence and conflict simultaneously. And so I've become really interested in how that younger generation experienced the war differently. They're younger, but also again, like thinking about how their mentors were always out of date. Because the style that they're painting in was out of date in Brazil at the time. It would have been out of date like within the kind of story of modernism. And so the way that, again, abstraction provided this kind of future projection that, you know, is the Guha quote again of like a kind of futural anticipation to be in the now with the dominant culture. So hopefully that made sense.
Yeah. We have more questions, but we also wanted to open to the audience. Anyone has any questions? Yes, there is one question.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to ask for all of you if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship of the artists that you study or the cultural workers that you study to communism. Thanks.
Can you be more specific? What stage of communism?
I mean, you all have different periods and stuff, so obviously I'm not going to be asking about the 1930s CPUSA in your case, Howie, but like, you know, in your case, we're going to be talking about the New Left, we're going to be talking, or like, you know, the various kind of Chinatown leftist formations, the Workers' Party, like the kind of, you know, post-Trotskyist formations, that kind of thing. You know, in the case of the 1930s, we're thinking about Ishigaki, right, like the Popular Front. In the case of Brazil, we're thinking about the various kinds of, you know, CPB, the various kinds of post-war leftist politics, Ishikawa, that kind of thing. So, I mean, there's just a lot of, it just seems like, sorry. You know, we're the period that we're looking at is the Cold War, right? And one of the things about the Cold War that is very important is that it divides Asia. And it divides Asia, and it also divides Asian communities outside of Asia. And to me, I was just curious if that's something you've seen coming up in your research. So obviously part of it is like, oh, I found out that like the guy I'm studying was like, you know, on CIA payroll or a Communist Party member. That kind of stuff is like one of the things I'm interested in, but anything else that comes up would also be interesting.
Anyone gonna? Because I want to say something like pretty quick because like I'm very interested in that story of Takaoka.
Yes,
One of the
so I mean,
artists you mentioned.
specifically is Takaoka, who was communist, and so it's earlier than were you talking about the Cold War? So obviously that was a problem of being both Japanese and a communist under Vargas, the president at the time, who was both anti-Japanese and anti-communist. So he was arrested, and so that's part of his story. But I don't, at least in my research, like in terms of articles at the time or interviews with him, I mean, it does not come up. But again, that's for obvious reasons. I would say that just second to the question of the post-war in Brazil, I mean, abstract art obviously plays a big part of that story, so that, you know, Mabi, for example, was very celebrated by Gomez Sicre, who was the Cuban curator who worked in Washington, D.C., and was very aligned with the U.S. project to celebrate and privilege abstract art because, again, it was anti-communist and celebrated freedom and liberation. That's, you know, the U.S. way. So, you know, they're kind of entangled in that story, but not necessarily because, like, Mabi was or was not, pro or against communism. So that is part of that story. But maybe Yuji can say more about Takaoka.
Oh no,
or share more.
I have also found difficult to find like direct archival material on Takaoka's political activities. But it's more like something that he's very remembered for. It's part of like everyone remembers how Takaoka was very politically active. But there's one thing that remained from that. That was his relationship to his son. That also is like a relationship that bridges these different periods. His son was an activist against the military dictatorship, and he was arrested in the 70s. And Takaoka would visit him, and he started teaching art in political prisons in Brazil. And there's an archive about that, and that's part of another project that also David is involved as well in a exhibition research project. But that's really, I'm like really curious if you, but it's like it's kind of like very difficult to find like real like.
I guess Christina Ong isn't here. She's working closely, looking at the history of the basement workshop. So what I do know of the contours of it is that what's represented in the exhibition is the early years, which is, I think, can represent more of like the communing part, not so much political communism, communing and how that meshes with Chinatown as a community and a diaspora. But I think the larger history that needs to be written, I think, is when political communism, international political communism, intersected with that communal model and the fractures that it created. And it's still, what I understand, a very tender spot, the kind of the fractures that happened after 74, 75. And I think that is in the realm of politics and ideology. And, you know, like that's, and you sense that unraveling, yeah, just from talking to people and that trauma of, and the melancholy of a lost fantasy of transformation, I think, is persistent with people who stayed in the arts or stayed in, or entered institutions in the academy. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the questions.
I have no juicy details to add. My research has only been done through the work that Tsunami left behind. I haven't been able to find much of his own papers or writing, and it's really through his documentary photos.
Any other questions?
I have a question that has to do with to do with the Japanese and the Japanese American, and I am thinking of Tsunami and Noguchi, because both worked with Mother Graham, and how that influence, like in the photography, you know, could have in art, more like in cases of, you know, dance or sculpture, or that, see what could be added to what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for your question. I mean, I think part of my impulse for starting this research was that as a historian, I studied Noguchi's work through photos of his exhibitions and his studio and his practice. And it's so interesting to think about the relationships that artists had with their own documentarians and how they chose to represent their own work for future generations. I don't know if Tsunami photographed Noguchi's work. I think so, but that would be a good question to look into.
Great. Carla, can you confirm at American Society? 30? Okay. Okay. So we are gonna wrap up the roundtable now, and we're gonna head to American Society. Or do you have anything to say?
No, just like there was one.
Sorry, there is one more question. Okay, let's.
I thought it was so interesting that you should do a show on invisibility and ghosts in the words, and how that overlaps with legacies in so many ways. And you're all talking about these kinds of invisible, you know, artists or Asian relationship to not only the whole idea of what does Asian culture relate to a culture, you know, contemporary that is so materialistic, but it overlaps with the legacy show and everything that I've been a part of. And I'm wondering, perhaps you were going to talk about it, that when we go to your center where your show is up, but I guess I'm curious, and I'd like to ask how you see these two things overlapping.
Absolutely. We will be talking about that in our curatorial presentation, but there is definitely a relationship. When we thought about invisibility, we thought about invisibility of not only peoples, collectivities, artists, art histories, especially considering a larger Latin American art history, you know, how the Asian diasporic production is almost invisible within these major narratives of Latin American art. So we are thinking about this kind of invisibility. We are also thinking about the invisibility and the erasures of Asians within major narratives of national formation in Latin American countries. And definitely that's closely tied to issues of legacy. And this is something that Chantal beautifully talks about in her own artworks when she is searching for her family, you know, and we see this a lot, reflected a lot in artists throughout Latin America from the diaspora that we have been in conversation. So yeah, I think that's, yeah, this invisibility and these ghostly figures and ghostly narratives, not only from art history, from family archives, from national archives, are definitely very central to our project.
There's like a very clear also temporal overlapping in our shows, I think. There's, even though like it might be like that some dates are not like fitting perfectly, but like I think in relationship to, right, to what was Mariola talking about artists of the pre-Second World War, like there were some things that were, it's not part of the time frame of our show, and then comes much closer to legacy in general. We do have like some like post-war examples, but like the focus of the show is mostly contemporary art, let's say.
I just want to add, I know we have short on time, but like I love the title of the appearance. I was just thinking, it reminds me of how Hannah Arendt talks about what it means to appear. You know, it's really about the ability to participate in the public. You know, and I think that complexity is so much more important than, I guess, like, you know, in Asian American art discourses, or even Asian American discourses about invisibility, visibility, inclusion, assimilation, disappearance, in very strict terms. But I like the idea that it's about kind of the ability to appear and participate in public, to have the agency to create novel ways of being. I was just talking to Joan Key yesterday, and she was saying that she really liked the idea that Asian American art is really a story of democracy. You know, and not, you know, it's like at the widest sense to participate in a demos in public. I think that is the most capacious way to think about maybe here, you know, and the hauntings of not being able to appear in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think just to finish, like to complement, sorry, is that like I talked about the time, but it's like it's in our show, like those questions, they are coming. That there's a reason that the focus also is more, it's closer to the present, is that those things are coming as part of preoccupation of the artists themselves that are explicitly grappling with these themes and proposing, you know, like approaches and frameworks. And we even adopted the title of an artwork for the show, that it's not the best example of this case, even though it is, if you look at like backstage stories, but yeah, but that's something that is part of, I feel like, a lot of the present moment in Latin, let's say, art made by artists of the Asian diaspora in Latin America. They're a lot like paying a lot of attention to those subjects. So the ghostly and the visibility.
Great, thank you so much, and see you very soon. Thank you.